We're ToppleGalloway.
I'm Steve Topple.
And I'm George Galloway. And we're kicking off, and I mean kicking off, about Jack Straw. The report of the Intelligence and Security Committee in the House of Commons just earlier this week has caused, well, nothing. It's caused nothing. Just like the Chilcot inquiry report 2 years ago this week, it's caused nothing. Nothing at all has been the result of a parliamentary committee's inquiry which proved beyond peradventure that British ministers systematically lied to the House of Commons and, rather more importantly and bloodily, profited from the torture of human beings by the United States in its extraordinary rendition period which lasted several years of the war on terror. Despite British ministers, particularly David Miliband and Jack Straw, telling us that Britain had nothing whatsoever to do with extraordinary rendition, would never agree to profit from torture, and that those of us who said otherwise were conspiracy theorists. That's what we were, Steve.
As we always are, George, yes. I mean, the implications, or rather, should I say, potential implications of this should be staggering. I mean, we have violations of international law. We have the senior-most ministers under Blair's administration directly in the frame for this. And yet, as you say, nothing more than a murmur.
It was a day of liberal newspaper headlines.
Yeah, the Guardian.
Nothing in the right-wing press particularly, although the right-wing press is torn because at least it's a Labour government that was presiding over all this, so that you can get a kick in at Labour. So the Mail flattered only to deceive in its coverage of it, but by day two it was gone.
Of course, absolutely. And so is this going to go the same way as the Chilcot inquiry, which in itself was sort of a quite ineffective tool, if you like, at exposing the real crimes of Tony Blair and his administration? But is this going to go the same way? I mean, some of the revelations were fairly staggering in this report, but you know as well as I do, it's nothing that most of us didn't know already. I remember you stood up in Parliament and directly got hold of Jack Straw, metaphorically,
Metaphorically, yeah. I wish I'd gone further.
No, of course. And so we know this. And the challenge is, firstly, that Theresa May's administration, if she pushes and investigates this, then it may well open up a can of worms for her government for as well not acting on this prior and allowing this information to stay silent.
This is the biggest problem. I mean, I believe in retributive justice. I believe that people should pay for their crimes and their sins. But even if you don't believe in that, the main problem is, by ignoring the Chilcot inquiry 2 years ago, ignoring this torture rendition inquiry just a few days ago, we make it more likely that future administrations, maybe even this administration, will commit exactly the same crimes. Yes. Because if you are not forced to pay for them, why should you stop doing them? And that's the real reason why the Theresa May government is defending the Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, by the way. Some of this happened on Gordon Brown's prime ministerial watch. They're defending that, not because they like Blair or Brown, though maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but because they're defending Cameron in his crimes against Libya. They're defending Theresa May, although she's a bit busy on other things, on her crimes in Syria and elsewhere. So each successive administration and the deep state that serves them all has to defend these crimes. There are one or two additional fail-safe points, though, that I'd like to make. It is a synonym that in our constitutional monarchy, we don't have a constitution, but we have custom and practice. Yes. Our custom and practice is that you can never directly lie to the House of Commons. And if you directly lie, you must pay immediately with your position, you must resign. be sacked. But in extreme cases, the Parliament itself must deal with you. The truth is, Jack Straw is still a Privy Councillor. He's still the Right Honourable, Jack Straw. It's the Right Honourable David Miliband. It's the Right Honourable, I kid you not, Tony Blair. These people are still Privy Councillors. They are still, therefore, within reach of Parliament, though none of them are in Parliament in either house. And it seems to me that when, in Miliband's case it was fleeting, he said, it's simply not true that we allowed the use of Diego Garcia, our base there, for American rendition flights. That was a lie.
Yes.
You could say it was a mistake, but it wasn't. It was a lie. The Foreign Secretary doesn't make mistakes in what he says at the dispatch box. It's written down by his officials. But in Jack Straw's case, Straw made a lengthy, verbose, as was his wont, lengthy denunciation of the allegations that Britain was involved in this torture. And as I said, accused those of us accusing him of being conspiracy theorists. In other words, crazy people, mad people. And this was legalized lying on a grand scale that cannot be allowed to go unpunished, in my view. And if it does go unpunished, it makes a mockery of any idea that Britain is actually a constitutional monarchy. I don't know if you've read the full report. I have. We were involved in 795 cases of torture. This from a government that was saying daily it was not involved in any. 795 separate human beings were tortured with us with skin in the game.
It's staggering, it's staggering.
It is.
And quite often as well, it was
three of them
evidence.
we paid, three of them we paid, by the way.
Yeah.
We paid for 3 of the torture sessions.
I saw that, yes. And
sorry.
No, it's fine. And what came off the back of some of these torture sessions I was reading was incorrect evidence as well. It was proven in the end to be categorically incorrect. But I think you alluded
to... If I torture you, you'll tell me anything.
Of course.
Even just because you think that's what I want you to say. Most of the time it's complete nonsense and untrue, apart from being immoral.
Yeah, and it would be a natural human reaction. Exactly, if someone is physically and psychologically abusing you to such extremes, you're going to do anything you can to stop that abuse happening.
Exactly.
But you alluded to a wider point, which I think is important, that that of course the full horror and the will to act on this report is not there, because it would then implicate what Cameron did with Libya, what May has done in Syria and Iraq, and that's crucial to sort of understanding the challenge with things like this, because this is nothing new. I mean, if you go back to the 1960s in America, they had the MK Ultra program, which was systematic, taking vulnerable people in American society and trialing out various experiments on them with a view to using torture techniques. And this is carried on over the decades, and it is a systemic problem, if you like, within not only our society but the sort of globalized order of things. And it seems acceptable to the Western imperial nations that for economic and democratic reasons they can abuse people from other countries, bend them to their will to get their own way. And this is a decades-old problem, and no amount of reports, if you like, in my opinion, are going to address this. We need systemic and systematic change within society to address these issues, because nothing new under the sun, unfortunately.
Bombing for peace, torturing for liberty.
Exactly.
That's really where we are. An extraordinary business, extraordinary rending.
There was an almighty ruckus on social media this week as Danny Dyer, star of EastEnders and General British Hardman, said on Good Evening Britain with Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid that David Cameron, that twat, Twat. Where is he? Twat. He called David Cameron a twat on
Spell
national.
it for the Americans.
What? Danny Dyer, David Cameron, or twat?
T-W-A-T.
T-W-A-T. It's a very
What does it
derogatory.
actually mean?
It's a very derogatory phrase in British culture. It refers to the woman's genitals. And so David Cameron was called a twat by Danny Dyer live on television. Now I don't know if you saw this, George. It was
I saw it live.
Oh, you did watch it live?
Lips move. These lips move.
It was the most bizarre piece of television because you had Danny Dyer flanked by the odious Piers Morgan, flanked by airy-fairy daytime TV presenter Susanna Reid, flanked by Jeremy Corbyn and Pamela Anderson. Now, if you'd have said to me in 2014 that Pamela Anderson, Jeremy Corbyn and Danny Dyer would be discussing Brexit with Piers Morgan, I would have told you you are out of your mind and you should be committed.
Well, it shows how things change.
It does, yes.
I let it be known that I thought Corbyn shouldn't have done that show because there he was surrounded by the flailing breasts of Pamela Anderson, formerly of Baywatch constituency, and Danny Dyer's swear words, for that's what it is,
yes.
a swear word, that's why it caused a ripple. And in the company of what seemed like, I'm sure there was no alcohol taken, a rather drunken, raucous show. The only reason I saw it is because it came on right after the World Cup football and the prospect of these juxtapositions that you mentioned.
It was delicious, wasn't it?
But I had never heard of Danny Dyer.
Okay.
It now turned, because I've never seen EastEnders, I've never seen Coronation Street, and he's in one or the other. But this, no, it's EastEnders because he's pure Cockney.
He is.
Except he's related to Henry VIII,
Indeed.
Edward the Confessor, and William the Conqueror, as well as, unbelievably, Thomas Cromwell, the advisor to Henry VIII. So not quite a salt of the earth, East London, but a blue blood.
Indeed.
But then turns out he's got a daughter who's currently in Love Island, about which the whole of this island appears to be talking. Now, there are many things that surprise you in life, and one of them is that Steve Topple watches Love Island.
Look,
tell us about it.
It's a vicious rumour. I watched it out of interest. I have a friend on social media who
That's like saying you're a little bit pregnant, or you've lost your virginity a little bit.
Look, Mr.
You've
Galloway.
watched Love Island, whether for a friend or for any other reason. Tell us. Don't hide it.
I have a friend who's a social media reality celebrity. He's a very nice guy, actually. And he was touted to be on Love Island, but it didn't come through in the end.
Abs didn't.
No, they didn't cut the mustard, as it were. Look, I find it. I've watched it a couple of times. I find it a fascinating insight, if you like. And this is on a serious note here. A fascinating insight into the way that the mainstream media, facilitated by sort of the capitalist class, if you like, are so hell-bent on dumbing the masses down.
It's perfect dumbing down. It's absolutely mindless. It plays into the sort of generation
where people have been trained that you can get royals and riches and anything you want if you have your 15 minutes of fame, and the only path to happiness and success is through the capitalist system, whether that be on reality talent shows or programs like Love Island. And it's essentially a nonsense. I don't really even understand the format. It's essentially people going on.
It's an orgy on television, isn't it?
I suppose it essentially is a sort of bacchanalian kind of affair.
And the people are chosen for their looks, not necessarily their brains.
Well, they're not chosen for what comes out of their mouth, and possibly what goes in their mouth, but that's another story. No, it's essentially a looks-based show where people sort of date and the public vote them off if they don't think they're making a good couple. But it's endemic of the sort of society we've become with this vapid celebrity culture that doesn't really mean anything. It dominates now, and unfortunately, you made a very good point about Corbyn. You saying he shouldn't do these kind of shows like Good Evening Britain, which was an alternative to Good Morning Britain. It's a very interesting point because the sort of celebrity culture that Danny Dyer is also a part of is now huge. And is there then a case for Corbyn engaging with that? And
well, of course there's a case for it, but it has to be chosen very carefully. And the main problem was Corbyn couldn't join in a conversation about Pamela Anderson's breasts because that would lose him support on another part of the constituency. Yeah. And by the way, Pamela Anderson is a very clever woman and a very brave and politically progressive one. Yes. She's a regular visitor to Julian Assange in his Calvary in the Ecuadorian embassy, for example. But that's not what she was on the show for. She was on the show to talk about her breasts, or to let men talk about her breasts. Yeah. And if you're sitting alongside someone who curses a fellow politician, a former prime minister, you have to watch your body language and how you are seen to be
smirk
responding.
There
was a tiny smirk.
There was
when he said that. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think we should put Jeremy Corbyn on Love Island in the next series.
Not just yet, no, but I think we can agree with the consensus that David Cameron is a twat. I'd go further and I'd say he was a Berkshire Hunt.
A political earthquake occurred this week in Mexico, which will reverberate throughout not just Latin America, but also the United States of America too. The victory of the left-wing presidential candidate, I say victory, but actually it was a landslide victory, with 53% of the poll in the first ballot, with the other two main candidates trailing tens of points behind, and the ruling party, the PRI, falling into third place. As political earthquakes go, they don't get much stronger than that. Who's the new president? AMLO, we call him. That's Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. But he's known on the street as AMLO, and it's on the street that he had his biggest impact. As a matter of fact, he comes from the street and is about to return to the street because he's moving out before he moves in of Mexico's presidential palace, and he's turning the palace into an art gallery. He's slashing his own salary, and he's dedicated to the 44% of Mexicans who live below the poverty line. He's also determined to change the way that the corrupt political class in Mexico enrich themselves beyond the dreams of avarice, whilst gunning down anyone that stands in their way. 300,000 people have been murdered in Mexico during the so-called war on drugs, which is usually a cover for other scores settling and the keeping in power of the oligarchy. Steve, this must have made a big impact on you as it did on me. He sounds like our sort of guy, no?
It's a fascinating result. I mean, if you, not least, he's smashed 100 years or so of a two-party system in Mexico, which has done.
Which was two cheeks of the same arse.
Yes, exactly, as most of our democracies are. Smashed that two-party system. He comes across with some very radical stances on things. He wants to immediately look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, doesn't he? NAFTA. He's immediately putting a halt to negotiations with that, I believe.
And he's certainly not going to pay for Donald Trump's wall.
Well, now see, that's interesting because Trump being Trump tweeted congratulatory dulcet tones towards AMLO, and then he also tweeted something that and he hopes we'll be able to work with him to help build the wall. I can't see that happening. However, it is fascinating. I mean, he seems to be putting sort of democratic socialist values at the heart of what he does. He talks a lot about raising the minimum wage for workers to lift people out of poverty, he's spoken a lot about pensions, he's spoken a lot about infrastructure. He's making a lot of noises off which seem to be correct, if you like, and you can't deny, I mean, a massive majority. I sit on the erring towards caution fence on this, just because of, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, just because of sort of some of the things I've heard him saying. I know he's mentioned, he said in the speech to a conglomeration of banking institutions in Mexico that he wasn't going to disrupt the Mexican economy and that they were safe with his support. He said there's no chance of them being nationalised or anything such with regards to infrastructure. I know he's looking at public-private partnerships to get infrastructure off its ground. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that we sort of see a situation where Mexico has had decades after decades after decades of corrupt rule that has no regard for the working classes, and so it's going to take a hell of a lot to turn that around.
No, I think you're absolutely right to be cautious. He's not Hugo Chavez, even less is he Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
The question for us is he Jeremy Corbyn or is he Tony Blair? And I think myself, he's more Corbyn than Blair. Matter of fact, and one of the many interesting things about this election was that he's a 64-year-old silver fox that tens of millions of young people in Mexico regard as a hero.
Ring any bells?
Ring any bells, exactly. I was on the Jeremy Vine show on BBC and made exactly that point, at which point the BBC moved swiftly on. They didn't want any comparison. But in fact, there is a comparison. At least in rhetorical terms, AMLO is more Corbyn than Blair. But you're right. In the mood music that he's played for the bankers and the industrialists and the rich, and on public-private partnerships, what could possibly go wrong with them, he's definitely seeking not to frighten the horses.
Yeah.
But in the context of 100 years of complete hegemony of the arse, even though it had only latterly, two cheeks, it's a tremendously dynamic situation that has now been unleashed. Because if your caution, and to some extent mine, is right, and he disappoints the people who flooded out to vote for them in unprecedented numbers, then that won't make the demands of those people go away. It'll merely lead to another stage of the struggle. But I'll tell you something else that happened on the Latin American front, or at least on the front of American Latinas and Latinos, was the stunning victory in the Bronx in New York City in the primary election for the congressional place, including the Bronx. You've only got to say the word the Bronx, you get a picture of the kind of place that it is. A 28-year-old Latina woman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, swept to the Democratic Party's nomination, even though she stood explicitly as a socialist, capital S, follower of Bernie Sanders, and was opposing a 10-time congressman, part of the Democratic Party establishment, a Clintonite, you might say. And this young woman, an engineer from a working class background, very beautiful young woman, dashing, swept to power. She absolutely annihilated her 10-time congressman opponent. And the Democratic Party is now in a state of panic. Is the Democratic Party the party of Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, or is it the party of Hillary Clinton and these others who led the Democratic Party to disaster by forcing Hillary Clinton as the candidate, which led directly to President Trump?
Absolutely. I don't think it can be underestimated just what this young woman has done, because it has now opened up that Pandora's box which the Democrats tried to firmly shut in the 2016 presidential election of, like you say, what does the Democratic Party stand for? Because if she's won on this capital S socialist platform in the Bronx, which albeit, okay, so it's a poor working class sort of traditional US big city community, the possibility is now endless, and the question's very big for the Democrats.
Well, as she pointed out, when the Democratic establishment said, well, that can win in the Bronx, but it can't win in the Midwest, she pointed out that Bernie Sanders won the primary in all of the crucial Midwestern states, like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, that Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. So it's a tremendous new twist in US politics. And of course, the establishment don't know whether to try and embrace this young woman and pull her towards them, or push and repel this young woman as something other, some kind of alien. They don't know what to do. One of them immediately tweeted that this is the fruition of Hillary Clinton's run for the presidency. Shows that the glass ceiling has been broken and women can win. This despite them throwing the kitchen sink at the woman when she was running, and despite the fact that she was a key ally of Bernie Sanders, who, I repeat, was cheated of the Democratic Party's nomination. And if he had not been, we'd now be talking about President Bernie Sanders coming to London next week. Just think about that.
So we currently have a tale of two tournaments going on. To bring back my Danny Dyer impression, we currently have the Russian World Cup lurching from success to success. And then off the back of that, starting with this week, we have the pinnacle of establishment pageantry, Wimbledon, starting, don't we, George?
We do,
it's
and not
wonderful.
that far away on the other side of London. But I just want to add to the point you just made. If it had been left up to the Blairite Labour MPs, like Stephen Kinnock, this World Cup would have been cancelled.
It would have been, yes.
The greatest World Cup in history, I would argue. But Wimbledon is in the news for all kinds of reasons.
It is.
First of all, Andrew Murray, who's British when he's winning and Scottish when he's losing, has had to pull out. So there will be no Murray Hill, as there's no Tim Henman, because that hill used to be called Henman Hill. The British have nobody to cheer for now in their own flagship tennis tournament, because Murray's pulled out because of injury. But the biggest scandal I saw, in the middle of a drought, with the grass turning golden everywhere, the Wimbledon officials are confiscating people's water when they bring it in. And you've got to pay them to keep your water in their cloakroom, because of course they want you to buy their drinks. Doesn't that tell you everything about the class composition of the World Cup compared to Wimbledon?
I think it does, yes. I mean, the World Cup, and look, I admitted on last week's show, and I think the week before's show, and maybe the week before that, that I'm no football aficionado, George. However, I have got quite into the World Cup. I've been watching. I saw a fantastic goal from Japan, I think, last night, and I'll be watching the England match again later. But I think it's spectacular how well the World Cup's gone. And then
it's almost unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
It's because the British Royals have been banned by the British government from going there.
Indeed, and then that quite nicely leads us into the point about Wimbledon. It's just endemic of the British establishment class's attitude to sport, if you like, and especially tennis, that it's somehow a realm for only the rich and well-heeled, if you like.
You're
and
it's until Wimbledon is stormed by the working class.
Yes.
The sans-culottes, all mineral water and Pimm's liberated and distributed freely amongst the people, our country will never be truly free.
Expropriate the strawberries, that's what I say.
Nationalise the cream.
Yes.
And the scones.
Indeed, quite. I think it's like I say, it's a fascinating example of the establishment class's attitude to sport, and it's this exclusionary tactics.
They better hope nobody dies of thirst in this baking heat.
Indeed,
it turns out that the water they brought was confiscated by the Blazers of the Wimbledon Tennis Club. Was it the Lawn Tennis Association?
Tennis Association, yes.
Redolent of another age. Well, that's all for us. We've been ToppleGalloway.
We have indeed. And as always, if you want to get in touch, if you have anything you'd like to ask, any topics you think we should lift out from under our hats, as we always do, bat them our way. We'll happily receive your unproverbial tennis balls via Twitter. Contact us at Mr. Topple or at George Galloway. Until next week, take care of yourselves.
Don't be a twit.
Just one more thing. Jack Straw, extraordinary rendition, Diego Garcia. This is nothing new under the sun. This has been going on, to the best of our knowledge, since at least the 1960s with the now infamous MK Ultra program, where the US government and the CIA took some of the most vulnerable people in society and experimented on them to use as a blueprint for their torture programs abroad. It's nothing new. For all we know, and the likelihood is, it's still going on to this day under Theresa May's government and Donald Trump's administration. And this is the point. As Naomi Klein described in her book, The Shock Doctrine, the shock is quite often physical, with Western powers torturing suspects to get information out of them, but the shock is also one of the system itself, whereby the US and the UK torturing people to impose their will and get their own way in countries for economic and power reasons. Until we have a systematic change within society, none of this is going to change, and it is going to continue just as it has since the 60s.
Ah, Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. AMLO has got a task on his plate: how to develop an independent country of 127 million people, half of whom live below the poverty line, and many of the rest are the richest people on the earth, with Donald Trump insulting you as gypsies, tramps and thieves, as the old song put it, and trying to build a wall between the two countries and making you pay for it. I don't know who the props department is, but these glasses aren't fit for purpose. The question is AMLO fit for purpose? Is he Jeremy Corbyn? Or is he Tony Blair? The jury is out, as are we, but we'll see you next week.